So the work that I'll present here emerges from research that I started several years ago on Félix Guattari's semiotic theory and how it informed his work on institutions. Now, during the course of that research, I became particularly interested in the idea of the institution as a semiotic environment, and have since continued to explore a semiotic framework to understand institutions and their potential for emancipation and empowerment. So I think it's going to be a prolongation of Elena's talk into kind of a different area. So the reason for this is because, in my view, there's still very little understanding of how institutions operate, and particularly how they operate both socially and environmentally in regimes that are both signifying and asignifying at the same time. This understanding is particularly important if we want to think how institutions participate in the production of subjectivity and how they can potentiate or hinder processes of emancipation. I have particularly focused on institutions of mental health care, which promotes collective practices of care. So this has been so far my study cases kind of concern practices of healthcare. I'm referring to post-war European movements of institutional psychotherapy in France, of Psychiatrica Democratica in Italy, and of therapeutic communities in the UK in the social psychiatry tradition developed by Maxwell Jones. All these were at the forefront of reforms in psychiatric care, but remain to some extent neglected today. Before I continue, I should do an important parenthesis to contextualize this work and why am I doing this work today. We should note how, in recent years, it has become very clear that the mental cannot just be described from the psychiatric or psychological perspective only. It has become a disputed and financialized object, constant prey to quantification, mapping and measurement, where diagnostic tools and clinical descriptions are increasingly influenced by the pressures to medicalize psychiatry and are subject to the powerful interests of psychopharmacological therapeutics, as well as governmental and private insurance logics. So, as much as nature, the mental has become an object of resource extraction. At the same time, what we refer to as care is also undergoing massive transformations. It is increasingly reduced to its psychological or physical dimensions and abstracted from a social, environmental context, such as from the family, the community, etc. This has contributed to its progressive deterritorialization from spaces of existence and life practices, and its mounting professionalization, pathologization, and medicalization. So it's not a coincidence that care is becoming today also a rallying cry for both environmental and social struggles. So it is in this view of a contemporary context where we are witnesses, where we can witness the mounting precarization of both social and environmental relations, that returning and try to learn from approaches to the mental and to care, developed in this case in the post-war, is particularly important, if not urgent. So in this paper, what I'll do is that I'll focus on what came to be known as the institutional analysis movement in the 50s in France, and I'll draw in particular on the case of the Clinique Laborde and speculate on institutional processes and their potential for emancipation and empowerment in contexts that span from the hospital to the city and the wider social field, and its infrastructural dimensions. So what I'll do is that I'll start locating the history of institutional psychotherapy, which then was renamed to institutional analysis, and hopefully I'll be able to raise some questions as to how these practices might be important today and how they can be transformed from psychiatric context to daily life. My purpose will be to argue the need to reclaim a social environmental framework and the collective practices of care to the present condition. The institutional analysis movement, or as it was first called, institutional psychotherapy, is what has been described as a third moment of psychiatry. One that moves away from the asylum, but also from the psychoanalytical tradition that focused heavily on a dual relationship between patient and doctor. So the institutional analysis movement was an alternative to both the regime of the law of the classic psychiatric hospital and the liberal contractual regime of the psychoanalytical approach. So the institutional analysis criticized both those approaches. One, it advocated that the physical conditions of the asylum, namely its seclusion, rigid and hierarchical social relations, impacted negatively on the life of patients, but it also rejected the secrecy surrounding the dual analyst-patient relationship. So as an alternative to those two approaches, those two paradigms, institutional analysis proposed to transform institutions of care, changing the focus from the individual to the collective and using and maximizing the therapeutic potential of the institution itself in all its dimensions. So in other words, the institution became the object of treatment. So in what follows, I will do a brief account of how this emerged. So this is what we're seeing now is the Hospital of Saint-Albin. So what was first called the institutional psychotherapy movement emerged at the end of World War II. At the epicenter of this development was someone called Francesc Tosqué, which was a Catalan psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, and left-wing militant fleeing Franco's military rebellion and the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. In Lozère, in France, he took the direction of this hospital, Saint-Albin Hospital, in the 1940s, which was a hospital isolated in the mountains. Its condition was extremely precarious, due not only to the scarcity of resources caused by the war, but also to its geographic and climatic surroundings. So led by a very pragmatic need to respond to the contingencies of war, but also by his belief that mental alienation, socio-political alienation were intrinsically linked, Tosqué put in place a radical transformation of the hospital. At the heart of this project was the idea that the hospital could no longer be dealt with as a passive instrument or a stable geographical site. Treatment could not be dissociated from institutional and social dynamics. And throughout this work, the hospital, its architecture, its activities, its staff, constituted, in its words, a healing collective or a collective soignant. So this vision led to, for instance, the elimination of uniforms for doctors and nurses, but also setting up collective activities and opportunities for social empowerment, such as the intra-hospital therapeutic clubs, or the Club Thérapeutique. The club was an associative structure composed of caregivers, patients and personnel, or even patients alone, that could take charge of activities in the institution. This was a fundamental tool, and the first time that something like this was developed, it was developed by Tosqué in 1958, and it allowed, through a hospital committee, an association managed jointly by the patients and their caregivers to take charge of the daily life of a psychiatric sector. So the club could manage the result of its own work, like the revenues of the cafeteria, for example, but it also took charge of the occupational therapy registers, outings, solidarity funds, etc. As such, it allowed the patients to participate of their own care and also contribute to the care of others. So you're not in a psychiatric setting just to receive care, but you also have the opportunity to contribute to the care of others, and you're part of your own care, limiting dependence on caregivers and personnel, and providing a sense of mutual accountability. So it's worth noting that one of the first things that Tosqué's orders at Saint-Albin was to tear down the walls of the asylum. Okay, so the huge walls that we can see in this picture here. So this is a quote from Tosqué. It's him saying, "One day, we tore down the walls of the compound. There was no longer a border between the hospital and the village of Saint-Albin. After the war, the liberation of the territory was also the liberation of the asylum." There can be few cases of the often repeated claim of tearing down the walls of an institution being so literally realized. The hospital was isolated in the mountains with about 600 patients, being only close to a small village. So for that reason, opening the walls to allow contact and trade with the village and access for food and supplies was of crucial importance for the fight against famine. But also it was vital to replace isolation and confinement by a more nuanced and integrated approach to mental health care, for instance, promoting the diversification of strategies of care that included non-medical services and home visits. So this became a frequent occurrence, given the deep integration of the hospital into the village's daily life. This broad range of activities and early spatial understanding of care has been given the name of geopsychiatry. So among those who trained at Saint-Albin, there's, for example, François Fanon, who spent 2 years training in the Toscase and whose posterior work on the nature of the relationship between the political and the psychological can be traced back or can be said to be influenced by this experience of Saint-Albin, Georges Canguilhem, whose discussion of the normal and the pathological be pivotal, and Jean Houry as well. So Jean Houry was a psychiatrist and would go on to found in 1953 the Clinique Laborde. The Clinique Laborde in Corps-Chevigny. He was joined by Félix Guattari soon after, who took on the administrative directorship of the clinic 4 years later, in 1957. Houry's understanding was that institutions of care were ill and it was necessary to treat them. So there was no point in treating patients without treating the hospital because the hospital was ill. It needed treatment. He coined the term pathoplasty, or I guess pathoplastic, which defined a particular illness affecting institutions and their pathological effects on patients. He developed the idea that, in part, patient symptoms were an effect of the atmosphere. Pathoplasty does refer to the way in which disorders were constructed in correlation with the environment. For example, an environment in which patients were not accountable for their actions and had no autonomy or control over their daily lives had pathological effect of the patient's lack of investment and engagement with their own life. But this illness did not affect patients only. It equally affected doctors, nurses, and staff in general, as these coexisted in the same institution and made part of the same institution, constituted the institution itself, and this could be caused by effects of power hierarchies, rigidity of routines, repetitive tasks, and so on. Guattari explains how it was sometimes harder for staff than for patients to engage in institutional analysis, precisely because of a certain fear of losing control over the field of expertise, resistance in letting go of the figure of the authority of the doctor, or letting go of professional hierarchies. So therapy required intervening in the environment itself. Therefore, for Houry and Guattari, an analysis of the institution was fundamental. As Houry put it, to treat the ill without treating the hospital is madness. To this effect, Guattari developed several activities, like the Patients' Club or an inter-hospital committee similar to the one in Saint-Albin. He also set up a series of organizational protocols with the primary goal of stimulating the autonomy of the patient, allowing them to regain a sense of responsibility and the meaning of their existence in an ethical and no longer technocratic perspective. Among other organizations and activities, there were things like the Patients' Clubs, the GRID, which I'll talk about later on, the newspaper, several group committees, workshops initiated or proposed by staff but voted for by patients, the theater, the democratic assemblies, and so on. So what was key is that the fabric and dynamics of Laborde's daily life were thought to offer therapeutic opportunities of diverse kinds. Within this, space was central. The main guiding principles informing their thinking of space were heterogeneity of spaces and freedom of circulation. This, of course, had to do with a certain conception of psychosis, which defends that the patients benefit from being able to move and experiment heterogeneity, so as to avoid rigidity or repetitive fixations, but it also comes from a conception that treatment should be multidimensional. That is, that they should concern the social, the psychological, the psychoanalytical, the biological, and the environmental. So let's discuss these two in detail, starting by the heterogeneity of spaces. Okay. In a classic hospital, medication was given in specific places, for instance, the patient's room. In contrast, at Laborde, medication was administered in different spaces by different people. The reasons for this were twofold. First, this allowed breaking the hierarchical differences between nurses and doctors that were inscribed in specific functions performed by each and attached to specific spaces they each inhabited. Secondly, this use of different spaces made it possible to extend the therapeutic space to the entirety of the institution, as all its spaces were considered to be meaningful locations for analysis. Guattari, for instance, recounts the importance of administering medication in a multiplicity of spaces rather than in the same room or with the same people, so as to avoid a rigid association between a place and an experience of being subjected to or being subject to a passive role, in this case, the act of being given medication. So in this sense, the series of events and workshops that Guattari organized were key in providing a multiplicity of practices that allowed patients to discover new spaces and new ways to inhabit the clinic. So this is just a plan of of the castle and also the surroundings, just to show really that all the space was being used with kind of different functions, and there was a free distribution of the places and circulation. As Henri explains, it is a matter of working in a random field in which there can be unexpected, multi-referential investments in a polyphonic dimension that cannot be programmed, but which can indirectly manifest itself if there are no structures that prevent this manifestation. The equipment cannot obtain this dialectical dimension. Our question is how to create a collective machine, a club, which is a part of it, that holds everyone accountable to all levels, allowing for unexpected effects. End of quote. So in this context, architecture was a non-negligible therapeutic factor. This is another quote from Jean-Henri. What does it mean that the patient goes every day for months to a dark space in an unfrequented service staircase, and a window, a place of opening to the beyond, a jump to death, a traditional phobic object? End of quote. For this heterogeneity of spaces to work therapeutically, the ways in which patients and staff circulated through the hospital had to change as well. The daily activities of the clinic had to allow patients to meet with caregivers, other patients, and even the outsiders who were occasionally invited to take part in hospital activities. This concern was central to the practice of institutional analysis. As another psychoanalyst involved with the institutional analysis movement, Pierre Dion remarks, and this is the quote, "The heterogeneity of spaces, groups, therapeutic activities, and interstitial times is of great importance in the multiplication of possibilities of the palette. But if the patient cannot move freely as to be able to take part in all of these transfers, even partial, fragile, multiple, that heterogeneity is useless. And this is not only physical movement, rather a freedom of movement as encompassing the psychic. This is why it is essential to put in place a system in which patients can easily choose their own path." So if for Henri and Guattari, the hospital environment should include a wide heterogeneity of spaces, both in terms of their atmosphere and their function, this was also because in that way, the wanderings of the patient throughout the institution could act as a basis for therapeutic opportunities. Now, as Henri reminds us, on his own words, of course, liberty of circulation means that there is a space and a circulation that allows one to move. In other words, a structure that makes it worthy to go from one point to the other. I simplify. Going from one point to the other, that means that if we take 2 points, A and B, it is necessary that A is not like A, is not, sorry. If we take 2 points, A and B, it is necessary that B is not like A. Otherwise, it's not worth to move. Now, if there's only a tablature of differentiation, that is to say, a kind of table of distinctiveness, at that moment we can go from one point to another, knowing that each point that we will arrive will not be the same as the first. It is ultimately a table of structure. Freedom of circulation, movement, requires that there be a table of distinctiveness. For this to happen, there must be others. This requires a collective structure. And this is end of quote. To allow for multiple investments, it is necessary to create conditions for liberty of circulation, a possibility of expression, not necessarily verbal, and opportunities of encounter, but also an heterogeneity of people responsible for the therapy and a diversity of places of existence. But not only, it is also necessary to engage actively in these activities. An analytical treatment of psychosis needs the patient to take on an active role. So instead of patients being removed from the tasks of daily life or retreating into the conservative, inactive role implied by the doctor-patient hierarchical status, the approach of institutional analysis was based on the core principle that patients should take responsibility for their own existence. This reconnection with life, with daily life, from an existential ethical perspective, had, as a consequence, a collective participation in the definition and organization of the concrete institution. And now I want to talk a little bit about the grid, which is another protocol that was developed at Laborde, and I think it kind of really allows to think of how in institutional analysis there was at least the attempt for the institution to be co-created that as part of a process of care. Let me just show you so just some images I haven't really shown, some of the spaces, sorry. Okay, here. So all these stills, I'm showing stills from 2 films that were made at Laborde. This is from Laborde, Le Droit à la Folie. It shows group discussions and a bit of the space. This is the organigram of Laborde. It's just interesting to see how there was different committees, different groups responsible for different things. It's also interesting to see how it kind of changes throughout the time. And here we have the grid, which I want to spend a little bit more on. So in this context, one of the organizational devices put in place that I already mentioned is called the grid, or La Grille. It was an experimental protocol aimed at expanding the therapeutic potential of the institutional spaces in its social and environmental dimensions. Succinctly, it was a rotating schedule of tasks and activities, which ensured accountability, experimentation with different types of activities and functions, depending on the concrete needs, but also an attempt to engage people with concrete tasks, and it involved both staff and patients. The institutional space was understood not merely as a container of social relationships, but as an active agent, allowing for an heterogeneity of encounters of diverse kinds, but also allowing to avoid rigid identifications or fixations. As Ari explained, this is all the more important as schizophrenics can hold to everyday life like characters. He works a bit in the kitchen, therefore he thinks he's the cook. In this way, the grid was a social environmental device. So let's look at it with more detail. So this is a sample grid from the 1960s that was published in a special issue of Recherche, and had kind of the opportunity to interview people that were working at Laborde. This is just one of the grids. He was constantly evolving and changing, and probably this is kind of the most elaborate version that they made just for the special issue of Recherche. So What the sample grid from the 1960s shows is names of people rotating on one side. So this side, so the vertical axis, and you have the horizontal, and the horizontal you have time from 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. Tasks comprise things such as dishwashing, house cleaning, kitchen and night shift duties, waiting at the table, etc., etc. Activities comprise of things such as the clubs, the journal, or the laundry. So tasks were associated with a certain level of disagreeability and were distributed among people according to a rota system, so everyone had to share the activities. This ensured the minimal daily functioning of the clinic and thus needed to be shared by everyone. The team, in turn, that managed the grid, they were called les grilleuses. As a rule, they could not be composed of doctors, under the assumption that it was to be preventable that the distribution of labor and the organization of the clinic would revolve around the medical structure. This was not to undermine medical knowledge or practice, but rather to say that the labor division should not be determined by the medical structure. So in the text La Grille, Guattari refers to the grid as an articulatory system whose goal was to render articulable the work's organization with subjective dimensions so as to allow for certain things to come into the daylight, to allow certain surfaces of inscription to exist. Just going to show another image and maybe we can speak more about all of these protocols in the Q&A or in the round table. So this is the second page of the grid, and here is just another. It kind of just shows how the tasks were attributed values as well, and you could kind of negotiate the grid or the tasks and activities that you could do according to a certain number of points. This usually kind of generated lots of conflict as well, which is part of the purpose of the grid, to make conflict visible, so it could be dealt with as well through daily life. Okay. Yeah. So the grid allowed to make evident social and environmental feedback effects that concern the whole of the institution. For example, it showed how the laundry was a popular space. So was the kitchen, less unsurprisingly. This is a quote that kind of describes the function of the kitchen. The kitchen then becomes a little opera scene. In it, people talk, dance, and play with all kinds of instruments, with water and fire, dough and dustbins, relations of prestige and submission. As the place for the preparation of food, it is the center of exchange of material and indicative fluxes and prestations of every kind. So from the perspective of institutional analysis, this is apparently an important aspect, which is everyone was disputing to be at the kitchen or spend some time in the laundry for some reason. It could just open a window into something else as a symptom, as a institutional symptom, something that would otherwise go unnoticed. At the same time, as an organizational protocol, it made power relations visible, in particular all those aspects left outside of the traditional doctor-patient relationship. It also brought to the forefront relationships existing in the background, the institutional context, its constraints, organization, specific practices, and so on. Each institutional event, material or immaterial, discursive or non-discursive, was giving expressive potential through a simple protocol like the grid, which we can discuss. It might seem as if it's just a schedule, but as a schedule, it kind of participated of the recreation, the collective constitution of the institution, because it was subject to feedback. Because every day there was meetings to revise tasks and activities. So in a way, the institution was the grid. The grid was the institution. It was a process of formalization, but collective formalization. So in this view, institutional analysis is fundamentally collective. This is not just because, in its strict meaning, analysis is no longer a privilege of the therapist only, but is collectivized. It takes place collectively in group sessions, discussions, etc. But I'd like to focus on another important meaning of collective, which I think for me is even more key. Analysis is collective because it takes place within social and environmental dispositions, linguistic and signifying dimensions, technical, economic, and sociological factors, rather than just purely personal and individual dispositions. Analysis here, in this context, should therefore be understood as an active, interventive, social environmental practice, and not simply a detached observation. Its aim is transformative, and it's the actual act of doing the institution, creating the institution, that is the act of analysis. Having said this, I think it is important to clarify one thing left implicit as a form of conclusion. While in English, the word institution, and I think in Portuguese as well, conveys forms of social organization close to the state institutions or similarly formal organizations, in French the term institution refers to any form of social formation as well to that which is instituted, to the act of instituting. The fact that the term has a wider amplitude in French helps explaining why institutional psychotherapy and analysis emerged from France, of course. But more importantly, helps understanding how the lessons and principles of institutional analysis might be relevant for today, in my view. To be concerned with the precarization of collective life in contemporary cities, it is to be concerned with the resulting effects over our mental health, as well as with the resulting consequences over the types of social relations we established among ourselves and the world we inhabit. It is to be concerned with care. In my view, the key spaces where alternative models are being tested are those of third sector organizations exploring different models of being together, of therapeutic communities, of social movements and popular organizations working on intergenerational relations of community and citizen-led projects. These are the spaces where contemporarily the most interesting forms of mental health militancy are being tested out and implemented. Which is not to say that they are not riddled with problems and difficulties. In particular, the socio-environmental dimension of institutional programming, and I think it's interesting as well today, maybe spend some time on thinking what we mean by programming, or what we want programming to be. So in particular, the social environmental dimension of institutional programming is something that remains poorly understood, mostly due to the disciplinary structures that keep humanities and environments in distinct contained fields of expertise. Precisely because of this, we still have to learn a lot from institutional analysis and what programming can be. It seems to me that interrogating the value of institutional analysis today and speculating about its possible mutations and forms beyond the hospital to a broader social scale is key. And I have to find my last page, which is here. So, quoting from Guattari, subjectivity becomes collective, which is not to say it becomes exclusively social. The term collective should be understood here in the sense of a multiplicity which is deployed both beyond the individual, on the side of the socius, as well as beyond the person, on the side of pre-verbal intensities indicating a logic of affect rather than of a logic of delimited sets. The important thing here is the constitution of complexes of subjectivation, multiple exchanges between individual, group, machine. These complexes actually offer people diverse possibilities for recomposing their existential corporeity, to get out of their repetition impasses, and in a certain way, to re-singularize themselves. End of quote. So collective is then to be understood not in the sense of a set or a group, but as an heterogeneous plurality that is mutually and transversally implicated or engaged. But to do so, the collective can never be given, must always be made. The collective, therapy, care are to be practiced, to be constructive continuously. So it kind of raises an issue of militancy as well. It is these practices that we can call institutional analysis that I believe are urgently needed today. Thank you.